Before history was written, before the rise of kingdoms, empires, and civilizations, before humanity ever carved its first mark upon the earth, there was God. He existed before time itself. Before the stars burned in the heavens, before oceans rolled across the world, and before a single human breath was drawn. Everything that exists today traces its origin back to that eternal moment when the Creator chose to bring order out of nothingness. Before we continue this journey through the greatest story ever told, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and follow for future episodes. Together, we will explore the lives, struggles, victories, and divine promises that have shaped human history and continue to speak to our lives today. In the beginning, there was only darkness and the deep silence of an unformed world. No mountains pierced the horizon. No rivers flowed. No birds sang in the skies. Then God spoke. His voice shattered the emptiness with a command that echoed through creation. Let there be light. Instantly, light burst forth and separated itself from darkness. Day and night were established, marking the first rhythm of a world that had not existed a moment before. The work of creation continued. The heavens stretched above the earth. Seas gathered into their appointed places, while dry land rose from beneath the waters. Valleys formed, mountains stood tall, and rivers carved their paths through the landscape. The world that had once been empty now began to flourish with beauty and purpose. Soon the earth was covered with life. Trees spread their branches toward the sky. Plants filled the fields with color and abundance. Fish swam through the seas, birds soared through the heavens, and countless creatures roamed across the land. Every detail reflected the wisdom of the Creator. Every living thing occupied its place in a perfectly ordered world, and God looked upon all he had made and declared that it was good. Yet among all these wonders, one final act remained. Creation was complete, but its highest purpose had not yet been revealed. God descended to the dust of the earth and formed a man with his own hands. The figure lay still and lifeless until God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. In that moment, Adam opened his eyes and became the first human being. He was not merely another creature among many. He was created in the image of God, entrusted with responsibility, dignity, and fellowship with his Creator. God placed Adam in a garden unlike anything humanity has ever known. Eden was a place of perfect harmony. There was no suffering, no disease, no fear, and no death. Every need was provided. Every day was filled with peace. Most importantly, God walked with his creation in close relationship. Nothing stood between them. But Adam was alone. Though surrounded by beauty and abundance, there was no companion equal to him. So God caused a deep sleep to fall upon him. From Adam's side, he formed a woman and brought her to him. When Adam saw her, he immediately recognized her as part of himself, a partner perfectly designed for companionship and love. Together, they became the first husband and wife, living in innocence and unity. There was no shame between them, no conflict, and no hidden motives. The world existed exactly as God intended. Yet even in paradise, a challenge stood before humanity. In the center of the garden were two special trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God granted Adam and Eve freedom to enjoy everything in Eden except the fruit of one tree. It was a simple command, but it carried profound significance. Love and obedience cannot exist without choice. Then came the serpent. Cunning and deceptive, he approached Eve with a question designed to plant doubt. He challenged God's word and suggested that the Creator was withholding something good. He promised that eating the forbidden fruit would open their eyes and make them like God himself. The temptation was not merely about food. It was about independence. It was about deciding truth for themselves rather than trusting the one who had created them. Eve looked at the fruit and saw that it was desirable. It appeared beautiful. It seemed wise. Slowly, the temptation overcame trust. She reached out her hand, took the fruit, and ate. Then she gave some to Adam, and he ate as well. In a single moment, everything changed. The innocence that had defined their existence disappeared. Their eyes were opened, but not in the way they expected. Instead of becoming greater, they became aware of their vulnerability. Shame entered their hearts, fear followed. For the first time in human history, they hid from God. When they heard the Creator walking in the garden, they ran into the shadows. The relationship that had once been marked by joy was now marked by distance. When God called out to Adam, the answer revealed the tragedy of the human condition. Adam admitted that he was afraid. Fear, guilt, and blame quickly replaced trust and harmony. Adam blamed Eve. Eve blamed the serpent. No one accepted responsibility. Sin had entered the world, and its effects spread immediately through every part of creation. God pronounced judgment. The serpent was cursed for his deception. Pain would now accompany human life. Labor would become difficult and exhausting. The earth itself would resist humanity's efforts. Most devastating of all, death became part of the human story. Yet, even in judgment, God revealed hope. He spoke of a future descendant of the woman who would one day crush the serpent's head. Though evil had won a temporary victory, it would not have the final word. A promise of redemption was planted in the very soil of humanity's failure. The story was far from over. Adam and Eve were driven from Eden. The gates of paradise closed behind them. The perfect world they once knew was lost. Beyond the garden lay hardship, suffering, and mortality. But beyond the garden also lay a promise that God had not abandoned his creation. Though humanity had fallen, the Creator's plan to restore what was broken had already begun. Outside the gates of Eden, humanity began a new and painful chapter. The world was no longer a place of perfect harmony. The ground resisted human labor. Thorns emerged where beauty once flourished. Fear and sorrow became familiar companions. Yet Adam and Eve carried with them the promise God had spoken. The promise that one day evil would be defeated. They could not know how long that journey would take, but history had already begun moving toward that future hope. In time, Adam and Eve had children. Their first son was Cain, and later came Abel. The two brothers grew up under the same sky, heard the same stories about Eden, and learned about the same God. Yet their hearts developed in very different ways. Cain became a worker of the soil, spending his days cultivating the earth. Abel became a shepherd, caring for flocks across open fields. As the years passed, a day came when both brothers brought offerings before God. Cain presented some of the produce he had harvested. Abel brought the firstborn of his flock and the very best portions he possessed. On the surface, both men appeared to be worshipping. Both came with gifts. Both approached the altar. But God looked beyond the offering itself and examined the heart behind it. Abel came in faith, offering his best with gratitude and trust. Cain's offering lacked that same devotion. God accepted Abel and his sacrifice, but he did not look with favor upon Cain's. The rejection struck Cain deeply. His disappointment quickly turned into anger. His anger hardened into jealousy. God spoke to him with a warning that still echoes across generations. Sin was crouching at the door, waiting to master him. Cain had a choice. He could resist the darkness growing inside him, or he could surrender to it. Tragically, he chose the second path. One day, Cain invited Abel into the field. There, far from witnesses, jealousy became violence. In a moment that would forever stain human history, Cain rose against his brother and killed him. The first child born into the world became the first murderer. Abel's blood cried out from the ground, and humanity crossed another terrible boundary. When God confronted Cain, he gave him an opportunity to confess. Instead, Cain answered with defiance. "Am I my brother's keeper?" The question revealed how deeply sin had already corrupted the human heart. Judgment followed. Cain would no longer enjoy the fruitfulness of the land. He would become a restless wanderer, separated from the place he called home. Yet even then, God showed mercy. Rather than allowing others to destroy Cain, he placed a mark upon him for protection. Justice and mercy stood side by side. As generations passed, Cain's descendants multiplied. Cities were built. Skills were developed. Human culture advanced. Yet something darker advanced alongside it. Violence spread from family to family. Pride grew stronger. Human desires increasingly replaced God's guidance. What began with a single act of disobedience in Eden expanded into a civilization shaped by rebellion. Century after century, the corruption deepened. People pursued power without restraint. Greed replaced gratitude. Cruelty replaced compassion. The knowledge of God faded from many hearts. The earth became filled with violence and wickedness. Every generation seemed more distant from the Creator than the one before. The biblical account describes a heartbreaking reality. God saw that every inclination of human thought was continually bent toward evil. The world he had once declared good was now consumed by corruption. The Creator looked upon his creation with sorrow. This was not the anger of a distant ruler. It was the grief of a father watching his children destroy themselves. Finally, a moment came when divine patience reached its limit. God determined that judgment would fall upon the earth. The corruption could not continue forever. Evil would not be allowed to reign without consequence. Yet, even in a world drowning in sin, one man walked a different path. His name was Noah. While others mocked righteousness, Noah pursued it. While society ignored God, Noah listened. He was not perfect, but he remained faithful in a generation that had abandoned truth. Because of this, Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. God revealed his plan to Noah. A great flood was coming, one that would cleanse the earth of its corruption. Noah was instructed to build an enormous ark unlike anything the world had ever seen. It would serve as a vessel of preservation amid coming judgment. The command must have seemed impossible. There was no blueprint from previous generations. No one had ever witnessed such a flood. Yet Noah obeyed. Year after year, he labored on the massive structure. Season after season, he continued building. Children grew into adults while the ark slowly took shape. More than a century passed in faithful obedience. Throughout those years, Noah endured ridicule and disbelief. People laughed at him. They mocked his warnings. They dismissed the idea of divine judgment. But Noah kept building. Faith is often tested, not in dramatic moments, but in long seasons of perseverance. Every hammer strike became an act of trust. Every plank placed into position became a declaration that God's word was true. Then the day finally arrived. Animals began coming to the ark in pairs, guided by a power beyond human understanding. Large and small, wild and tame, they entered exactly as God had commanded. Noah and his family followed them inside. Then something remarkable happened. God himself closed the door. Outside, life continued as usual. People worked, traded, celebrated, and planned for tomorrow, unaware that history was about to change forever. Dark clouds gathered overhead. Thunder rolled across the horizon. Rain began to fall. At first, it may have seemed insignificant, but the rain intensified. Day after day, the heavens poured out water. Springs burst forth from beneath the earth. Rivers overflowed. Valleys disappeared beneath rising waters. Mountains vanished from sight. For 40 days and 40 nights, the storm raged. The world that had rejected God found itself overwhelmed by judgment. Everything outside the ark perished. Human pride, human achievement, and human power proved helpless against the forces unleashed by the Creator. Yet inside the ark, life endured. Noah, his family, and the animals remained safe, carried above the waters that covered the earth. The same flood that brought judgment also became the means of salvation for those who trusted God's provision. Eventually, the rain ceased. The waters slowly receded. After many months, the ark came to rest upon the mountains of Ararat. Noah waited patiently for God's direction. He released a raven. Later, he sent out a dove. Finally, the dove returned carrying an olive leaf, a small but powerful sign that life was returning to the earth. At last, God commanded Noah and his family to leave the ark. As they stepped onto dry ground, they entered a world washed clean. Humanity was beginning again. Noah's first act was not to build a home or plant a field. Instead, he built an altar and worshipped the God who had preserved them. Then God established a covenant. He promised that never again would a flood destroy the entire earth. As a visible reminder of that promise, he placed a rainbow in the clouds. Whenever future generations looked upon its colors stretching across the sky, they would remember both God's justice and his mercy. The flood had ended, but the greater story was only beginning. Humanity had been given another opportunity, another fresh start. Yet the deepest problem still remained within the human heart. The world had been cleansed by water, but mankind still needed something even greater. A redemption that would one day fulfill the promise first spoken outside the gates of Eden. The rainbow still stretched across the heavens as a reminder of God's covenant with Noah. Humanity had been given a new beginning. The earth was once again filled with opportunity. Noah's descendants spread across the land, raising families, building settlements, and establishing the foundations of future civilizations. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that mankind had learned from the tragedies of the past. But the deeper problem had survived the flood. The waters had cleansed the earth, yet they had not removed the pride hidden within the human heart. As generations multiplied, people remained united by one language and one culture. Their growing numbers gave them confidence. Their shared abilities gave them power. Instead of seeking the Creator who had preserved their ancestors, they began looking inward, convinced that humanity itself could achieve greatness without God. Eventually, they settled in a broad plain known as Shinar. There they conceived a bold and ambitious project. What began as cooperation soon transformed into rebellion. The people said to one another, "Come, let us build a city for ourselves. Let us construct a tower that reaches into the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves." At first glance, the project appeared impressive. Skilled builders shaped bricks and assembled vast structures. Day after day, the tower rose higher. Workers celebrated their progress. Leaders dreamed of a future where humanity's achievements would be admired throughout the world. Yet, beneath the surface, something dangerous was growing. The tower was not truly about architecture. It was about independence. It was a monument to human pride. Rather than glorifying God, they sought to glorify themselves. They wanted security without dependence on the Creator. They wanted significance without obedience. They wanted unity apart from God. History was beginning to repeat itself. In Eden, humanity had reached for equality with God. Now, an entire civilization was doing the same thing on a larger scale. God saw what was happening. He understood where this path would lead. Left unchecked, human arrogance would only deepen, so he intervened. In a single moment, the language that had united mankind was divided. Workers who had spoken fluently with one another suddenly found themselves unable to communicate. Instructions became confusion. Cooperation became frustration. Conversations dissolved into misunderstanding. The great project came to a halt. The tower that was meant to reach heaven stood unfinished. Families gathered with those who could still understand them. Communities separated. Groups migrated in different directions across the earth. Languages multiplied. Nations emerged. The dream of human self-exaltation collapsed beneath the weight of divine intervention. The city became known as Babel, a lasting reminder that human greatness built upon pride can never endure. Yet even as nations scattered, God was preparing the next chapter of his plan. While humanity attempted to make a name for itself, God chose one man through whom he would create a lasting name. He was not a king. He commanded no army. He possessed no empire. In fact, he lived among people who worshipped many false gods. His name was Abraham. One day, the voice of God interrupted his ordinary life with an extraordinary command. "Leave your country. Leave your relatives. Leave your father's house. Go to the land that I will show you." There were no maps, no detailed explanations, no guarantees of comfort. Abraham was asked to abandon everything familiar and follow a destination known only to God. For many people, such a command would have seemed unreasonable. Yet Abraham responded differently. He chose faith over certainty. He chose obedience over comfort. He packed his belongings, gathered his household, and began walking toward an unknown future. Every step became an act of trust. God accompanied that command with a remarkable promise. He declared that Abraham would become the father of a great nation. His descendants would be countless. Through his family, all the nations of the earth would one day be blessed. The promise was breathtaking. The problem was that Abraham and his wife Sarah had no children. Years passed, then more years passed. Abraham continued believing, but the fulfillment of the promise seemed increasingly impossible. Sarah remained barren, their bodies grew older. Hope became harder to maintain. Like many people facing long seasons of waiting, they began searching for their own solution. Sarah suggested that Abraham have a child through her servant, Hagar. Abraham agreed, and a son named Ishmael was born. To human eyes, the problem appeared solved. But God's promises are not fulfilled through human shortcuts. Years later, God spoke again. He reaffirmed his covenant and declared that Sarah herself would bear a son. Abraham was nearly 100 years old. Sarah was 90. The promise sounded impossible even to them. Both laughed at the idea. Yet God's plans are not limited by human limitations. The same God who created light from darkness and life from dust was fully capable of bringing life where none seemed possible. Then the miracle happened. Sarah conceived. When the child was born, Abraham and Sarah named him Isaac, a name associated with laughter. But this time the laughter was not rooted in doubt. It was the laughter of joy, wonder, and gratitude. After decades of waiting, God had fulfilled his word exactly as he promised. Isaac became the living evidence that God's timing is often different from ours but never late. For a season, life seemed complete. Abraham finally held the son he had waited for all his life. Every promise appeared to be unfolding beautifully. Then came the greatest test of all. One day God called Abraham again. "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. There offer him as a sacrifice on a mountain I will show you." The command must have shattered Abraham's heart. This was not merely his son. This was the child of promise, the miracle child, the future of the covenant. Everything God had promised seemed connected to Isaac. Yet once again, Abraham chose obedience. Early the next morning, he began the journey. For 3 days, he traveled toward the mountain. Every step carried unimaginable weight. Isaac walked beside his father, unaware of the full purpose of the journey. When they reached the place God had designated, Abraham built an altar. He arranged the wood. Isaac noticed something troubling. "The fire and the wood are here," he said. "But where is the lamb for the sacrifice?" Abraham looked at his son and answered with remarkable faith. "God himself will provide the lamb." Together they climbed higher. At the summit, Abraham bound Isaac and placed him upon the altar. The moment was almost unbearable. Yet Abraham trusted that somehow God would remain faithful to his promises. Then, as the knife was raised, heaven intervened. A voice called out his name. "Abraham! Abraham!" Immediately he stopped. God had never intended for Isaac to die. The test had revealed the depth of Abraham's faith. Looking nearby, Abraham saw a ram caught in a thicket. God had provided a substitute sacrifice. Relief flooded the mountain. The ram was offered in Isaac's place, and Abraham named that place, "The Lord will provide." Yet the significance of that moment reached far beyond Abraham's lifetime. On that mountain, God painted a prophetic picture for future generations. A beloved son stood under the shadow of sacrifice. A substitute was provided. Mercy triumphed where judgment seemed certain. The covenant continued. The promise remained alive. Through Isaac would come future generations, future nations, and ultimately the unfolding story of redemption that God had been orchestrating since humanity first left the Garden of Eden. The covenant God, established with Abraham, did not end on Mount Moriah. The promise continued through Isaac, the miraculous son who had once lain upon the altar and then been spared by divine intervention. As Isaac grew older, married Rebekah, and began his own family, the story of God's covenant entered another generation. Yet once again, the path forward would not be simple. God's promises often move through imperfect people, and Isaac's family would prove no exception. For many years, Isaac and Rebekah remained childless. Like Abraham and Sarah before them, they experienced the pain of waiting. Eventually, God answered their prayers, and Rebekah conceived. But her pregnancy was unlike any other. The children struggled within her womb so violently that she sought God's guidance. The answer she received was extraordinary. God revealed that 2 nations were growing inside her. 2 peoples would emerge from her sons, and the older would serve the younger. Long before either child took his first breath, God's sovereign plan had already been declared. When the twins were born, their differences were immediately apparent. The first child emerged covered with red hair and was named Esau. The second came grasping his brother's heel, and he was named Jacob. As they grew, their personalities moved in opposite directions. Esau became a rugged outdoorsman, a skilled hunter who loved the open fields and the excitement of the chase. Jacob preferred a quieter life, spending much of his time near the tents and among the family. Isaac favored Esau, admiring his strength and adventurous spirit. Rebekah favored Jacob. Beneath the surface, the seeds of future conflict were already taking root. One day, Esau returned from hunting exhausted and hungry. Jacob was preparing a meal when his brother arrived. Desperate for food, Esau begged for some of the stew. Seeing an opportunity, Jacob made a shocking proposal. "Sell me your birthright." The birthright represented far more than material inheritance. It carried spiritual significance, family leadership, and a special connection to God's covenant promises. Yet in that moment, Esau viewed immediate satisfaction as more important than future blessings. Driven by hunger and impatience, he agreed. A bowl of stew was exchanged for a sacred privilege. The transaction revealed something deeper than poor judgment. Esau treated spiritual inheritance as something ordinary and expendable. What should have been treasured was surrendered for a temporary desire. Years passed, and Isaac eventually grew old. His eyesight faded, and he sensed that the end of his life was approaching. Determined to pass on the family blessing, he called Esau and instructed him to prepare a special meal before receiving the formal blessing reserved for the firstborn son. But Rebekah overheard the conversation. Remembering God's earlier prophecy and favoring Jacob, she devised a plan. She instructed Jacob to disguise himself as Esau. Goat skins were placed on his arms to imitate his brother's hairiness. Special clothing completed the deception. Jacob hesitated, but ultimately agreed. Together they entered Isaac's tent. The old patriarch was suspicious. The voice sounded like Jacob's, yet the hands felt like Esau's. Confusion lingered, but eventually Isaac pronounced the blessing. Words of prosperity, authority, and covenant favor flowed from father to son. The blessing was given. Moments later, Esau arrived. The terrible truth became clear. The blessing could not be taken back. Heartbroken and furious, Esau cried out in despair. His grief quickly transformed into anger. He vowed to kill Jacob after their father's death. Fear swept through the family. Rebekah urged Jacob to flee immediately. What began as deception ended in separation. Jacob left home with little more than the promise of God and the consequences of his own actions. As he traveled northward, loneliness settled over him. The familiar faces of home disappeared behind him. For the first time, he faced an uncertain future alone. One evening, exhausted from his journey, Jacob stopped to rest in the wilderness. Using a stone as a pillow, he fell asleep beneath the open sky. That night, everything changed. Jacob dreamed of a ladder reaching from earth to heaven. Angels moved up and down upon it, revealing an unseen connection between the earthly and divine realms. Above the ladder stood God himself. The Lord spoke directly to Jacob. The covenant first given to Abraham and then confirmed to Isaac would continue through him. God promised land, descendants, protection, and future blessing. Most importantly, he promised his presence. When Jacob awoke, he was overwhelmed. Surely the Lord had been in that place. He took the stone he had used as a pillow and set it up as a memorial. The location became known as Bethel, meaning house of God. What began as a night of loneliness became a turning point in his spiritual journey. Jacob continued traveling until he arrived in the land of his relatives. There he met Rachel. The moment was unforgettable. She came to a well with her father's sheep, and Jacob was immediately captivated. For the first time in years, hope began replacing loneliness. He agreed to work for her father, Laban, for 7 years in exchange for Rachel's hand in marriage. The years passed quickly because of his love for her. At last, the wedding day arrived. But during the night, Laban carried out a deception of his own. When morning came, Jacob discovered that he had married Leah instead of Rachel. The deceiver had been deceived. The man who once disguised himself to mislead his father now experienced the pain of betrayal firsthand. Laban agreed to give Rachel as well, but only if Jacob served another 7 years. So Jacob worked again. 14 years of labor taught lessons that could never have been learned in comfort. Through disappointment, hardship, and family struggles, God slowly reshaped Jacob's character. The process was long. Transformation often is. Eventually, God instructed Jacob to return home. Yet as he approached the land he had fled years earlier, fear resurfaced. Esau was coming to meet him, with 400 men. Jacob's old sins suddenly felt very close. The night before their meeting, Jacob found himself alone beside the Jabbok River. There, in darkness, a mysterious figure confronted him. The struggle lasted throughout the night. It was more than a physical battle. It became a spiritual confrontation between the man Jacob had always been and the man God was calling him to become. Jacob fought desperately, refusing to let go. As dawn approached, the stranger touched Jacob's hip, leaving him permanently injured. Then came a life-changing question. "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. The name meant deceiver. Supplanter, one who grasps and manipulates. But God was giving him a new identity. "You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed." The old name represented who he had been. Israel represented who he was becoming. He left that encounter limping, yet transformed. His walk would never be the same again, physically or spiritually. The next day, the moment of truth arrived. Jacob saw Esau approaching with his men. Fear tightened his chest. Years of guilt weighed heavily upon him. He expected revenge. He expected judgment. Instead, something unexpected happened. Esau ran toward him, not with a weapon, but with open arms. The brothers embraced. Years of anger dissolved into tears. Resentment gave way to reconciliation. The relationship that had been shattered by deception was restored through forgiveness. It was a moment that demonstrated a profound truth. God's grace is capable of healing wounds that seem impossible to repair. The covenant family moved forward, not because they were flawless, but because God remained faithful despite their failures. And through the newly named Israel, the next chapter of redemption history was preparing to unfold. The reconciliation between Jacob and Esau marked the end of one chapter, but God's covenant story was still unfolding. Jacob, now called Israel, would become the father of a growing family through whom the promises given to Abraham would continue. Yet among all his sons, one stood apart. His name was Joseph. From an early age, Joseph occupied a special place in his father's heart. Born to Rachel, the woman Jacob loved most, Joseph became the object of unusual affection. To demonstrate that love, Jacob gave him a richly ornamented robe, a garment unlike anything worn by his brothers. The robe became a symbol. To Jacob, it expressed affection. To Joseph's brothers, it represented favoritism. Resentment quietly grew within the family. Every glance at the colorful robe reminded them of what they believed was injustice. The tension intensified when Joseph began sharing unusual dreams. In one dream, bundles of grain in a field bowed down before his own bundle. In another, the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed before him. The meaning seemed obvious. Joseph spoke of a future in which his family would one day honor him. Whether youthful enthusiasm or simple honesty motivated him, the effect was disastrous. His brothers' jealousy deepened into hatred. They could tolerate the robe. They could not tolerate the dreams. One day, when Joseph was sent to check on his brothers as they tended flocks far from home, they saw him approaching in the distance. The sight of the robe stirred their anger once more. "There comes the dreamer," they said. A conspiracy quickly formed. At first, some proposed killing him outright. Others hesitated. Eventually, they seized Joseph, stripped away the robe that symbolized their resentment, and threw him into a deep pit. Imagine the terror Joseph must have felt. Only hours earlier, he had been a favored son. Now he sat alone in darkness, abandoned by his own brothers. Soon a caravan of traders passed nearby on its way to Egypt. Seeing an opportunity for profit, the brothers sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver. A brother became a slave. The traders carried him away while his family returned home with a fabricated story. They stained Joseph's robe with animal blood and convinced Jacob that his beloved son had been killed by a wild beast. The deception shattered their father. Meanwhile, Joseph crossed into Egypt, leaving behind everything familiar. From a human perspective, the dreams appeared dead, but God was still working. In Egypt, Joseph was purchased by Potiphar, an influential official serving Pharaoh. Though separated from his homeland and stripped of his freedom, Joseph refused to surrender to bitterness. Instead, he worked diligently and faithfully. Remarkably, success followed him. Potiphar recognized Joseph's integrity and entrusted him with increasing responsibility. Eventually, Joseph managed the entire household. Despite his circumstances, God's favor remained upon him. Then another test emerged. Potiphar's wife became attracted to Joseph and repeatedly attempted to seduce him. Day after day, she pressured him. Joseph faced a choice between temporary pleasure and lasting faithfulness. He chose integrity. Joseph refused her advances, declaring that such an act would betray both his master and his God. Humiliated by rejection, she turned accusation into a weapon. When Joseph again resisted her, she falsely claimed that he had assaulted her. Potiphar, enraged by the apparent evidence, had Joseph imprisoned. Once again, faithfulness seemed to lead not to reward but to suffering. Yet even in prison, God had not abandoned him. Joseph quickly earned the trust of those around him. The prison warden placed him in charge of many responsibilities. The same leadership qualities that distinguished him in Potiphar's house now emerged behind prison walls. While there, Joseph encountered two officials who had served Pharaoh, a cupbearer and a baker. Both experienced troubling dreams and sought understanding. Joseph explained that interpretations belonged to God. The cupbearer would be restored to his position. The baker would face execution. Both interpretations proved accurate. Before departing, Joseph asked the restored cupbearer to remember him before Pharaoh. Surely this would be his opportunity for freedom. But the cupbearer forgot. Days became months. Months became years. For 2 more years, Joseph remained imprisoned, seemingly overlooked and forgotten. Then one night, Pharaoh himself had disturbing dreams. He saw 7 healthy cows devoured by 7 thin cows. He saw 7 full heads of grain swallowed by 7 withered heads. None of Egypt's wise men could explain their meaning. Suddenly, the cupbearer remembered Joseph. The prisoner was summoned before Pharaoh. Standing before the most powerful ruler in the world, Joseph listened carefully. Then he explained the dreams. 7 years of extraordinary abundance would come upon Egypt. They would be followed by 7 years of devastating famine. The dreams were a warning and a preparation. Joseph then proposed a strategy. During the years of plenty, Egypt should store surplus grain. When famine arrived, those reserves would preserve the nation. Pharaoh immediately recognized both the wisdom of the interpretation and the wisdom of the plan. In a stunning reversal, Joseph was elevated from prisoner to prime minister. One day, he wore prison garments. The next, he wore royal authority. Only Pharaoh himself held greater power. The years unfolded exactly as Joseph predicted. Abundant harvests filled Egypt's storehouses. Grain was gathered in enormous quantities. Then the famine arrived. Its effects spread far beyond Egypt. Nations struggled. Families suffered, including Joseph's own family in Canaan. Driven by hunger, Joseph's brothers traveled to Egypt seeking food. They stood before the powerful official who controlled distribution throughout the land. They did not recognize him, but Joseph immediately recognized them. The dreams of his youth were unfolding before his eyes. The brothers bowed before him. At that moment, Joseph possessed the power to take revenge. Years of betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment could have fueled bitterness. Instead, he chose a different path. Before revealing himself, Joseph tested his brothers. He wanted to know whether the men who had once sold him had changed. Through a series of carefully designed situations, he observed their responses. This time, something was different. The brothers demonstrated genuine concern for one another. They expressed regret over their past actions. Most importantly, they showed willingness to sacrifice themselves for the sake of their younger brother, Benjamin. The transformation was real. Unable to contain his emotions any longer, Joseph dismissed the Egyptian attendants and revealed his identity. "I am Joseph." The room fell silent. Shock, fear, and disbelief overwhelmed his brothers. Yet Joseph spoke words that transformed the moment. "Do not be afraid. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Those words summarize one of the most profound truths in Scripture. Human evil is real. Human choices have consequences. Yet God's sovereignty remains greater. What others intended for destruction, God used for preservation. Joseph invited his entire family to settle in Egypt, where they would survive the famine. Soon, Jacob himself arrived. The aging patriarch, who had mourned Joseph for decades, embraced the son he believed had been lost forever. Father and son were reunited. The family was preserved. The covenant line continued. As Genesis draws to a close, its great themes become unmistakably clear. God is the creator who stands before time, history, and creation itself. Human sin has corrupted every generation, from Eden to Egypt. Yet judgment is never God's final word. Again and again, mercy accompanies justice. Faith consistently proves more important than circumstances. Noah built while others mocked. Abraham walked without knowing his destination. Joseph trusted while imprisoned. God repeatedly works through imperfect people. Abraham doubted. Jacob deceived. Joseph's brothers betrayed him. Yet God's purposes continued. Most importantly, the covenant never failed. Empires rose and fell. Families struggled. Individuals sinned. Yet God's promises endured through every challenge. From the Garden of Eden to the Palace of Egypt, a single thread runs through the entire story: the unfolding plan of redemption. Generation after generation, God preserved the line through which blessing would eventually come to all nations. Genesis is therefore far more than a book about beginnings. It is the foundation of a much larger story. It reveals a creator who never abandons his purposes, a God who remains faithful despite human failure, and a promise that continues moving forward through history toward its ultimate fulfillment. And with Joseph's final days in Egypt, the curtain closes on the first great act of the biblical story, while the greater drama of redemption continues to unfold.